Hi, this is Gus Fikowski for AP Gov, and in this video we're going to be looking at the way that Congress behaves as well as the impact on presidents and Congress. So, with respect to voting on a bill, there are typically four positions that a congressperson is going to take. You have the trustee, who is basically evaluating the bill on terms of its merit. How well will it benefit or hurt the individual district or state that you represent? You then have the partisan vote, which you vote the way that your party votes. And that is, of course, the most predictable way that a person will vote in Congress is the partisan way. And of course, that has a lot to do with committee assignments, because of certainly the more party loyalty you have, the greater likelihood you are to have a better committee, which comes with more power and other good perks. You then have the delegate, which ideally is the way that Congress should be behaving in voting, and that is, of course, voting the way that the people want. And then you have a fourth term, which is known as the politico, which is a combination of both the delegate and the partisan. And, I would say that you probably see the partisan much more often and then sometimes mixed in with the politico, but certainly these are four positions that a congressperson could take on a potential bill. So certainly party influence is very important. Party leaders, of course, from the Senate Majority Leader to the Speaker of the House, cannot force party members to vote a particular way, but again, many do vote along party lines, which unfortunately is going to enhance party polarization, where you're voting with us or against us, right? There's no bipartisanship, and certainly that's something that has been lacking in Congress for quite some time. And ultimately, this can lead to policy gridlock, where you have conflicting policies, especially amongst the states. Nothing gets done, and that is very, very, problematic. And as I mentioned just earlier, one reason why many do vote against, along party lines, is the importance of the committee selection here. You do not want to wind up on a subcommittee for aging. You want to be on the Ways and Means Committee, which deals with tax bills in the House. That is a much more powerful and much more influential committee to be on. So the importance of committee selection cannot be understated. It's also important to note that when you compare and contrast whether the constituency or the ideology is going to influence the congressperson more, typically it's going to be the ideology that's going to be the prime determinant of a member's vote. On issues that are not the most important, they're going to certainly probably ignore their constituents' opinion, but certainly on more controversial issues, it would probably be wise to heed the constituent opinion, because you do not want to get voted out of office. But again, ideology drives a lot of the vote in line with the party. And moving on to divided government, and certainly we've seen a lot of this happening, which has increased party polarization. And this refers to when a party does not have complete control of Congress or the presidency. So a hypothetical example, if Republicans control the House and the Senate, but Democrats control the presidency, that's divided government, because power is divided amongst Congress versus, let's say, the presidency. Now, under President Trump's first term, divided government is not the case. And with President Trump, both the Senate and the House of Representatives during the first 2 years are not an example of divided government. It's actually very rare, as you see on this chart over here. Since 1968, there have been 14 years in which one party controls the entire House, Senate, and White House. You see George W. Bush being, one of the only ones where that has happened in recent history, aside from President Trump. But nevertheless, when you do have divided government, this can be very difficult because it can lead to gridlock. It can also lead to the Congress, more specifically the Senate, to refuse to confirm appointments, especially of a lame duck president. And this is a prime example of this was with Justice Garland when President Obama nominated him to the Supreme Court. But since Republicans controlled the Senate, Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader at the time, refused to have him confirmed or even schedule a hearing. So the divisions can have significant implications as to who gets onto the Supreme Court, what gets done, or what doesn't get done. And oftentimes with divided government, a lot does not get done. Also, a major influence on the congressional process are, of course, lobbyists and interest groups. And that, of course, is an entire separate chapter. But, of course, just to mention it here, there are more than 35,000 registered lobbyists. I mean, that is a lot of influence over Congress. And certainly the bigger the issue, and of course more finances involved in the issue, certainly you're going to see more lobbyists working on it. There have been instances, and especially accusations, of lobbyists giving a bill that they wrote and giving it to that person, to that congressperson to introduce. So that is a huge effect that lobbyists have. Now, they are typically hired by interest groups to lobby members of Congress, especially trying to influence how they vote. Now, at times, lobbyists certainly can be ignored, shunned, or even regulated by Congress. For example, lobbyists cannot bribe members of Congress. That is completely illegal. So it really does depend on the nature of the issue, but it is definitely important to note that lobbyists certainly do influence legislators' votes, definitely, without a doubt. Now, what is the president's role in Congress? Well, the president is going to certainly try to persuade Congress, and, when there's a piece of legislation that the president wants passed, such as President Trump with the tax bill, he's going to be lobbying and meeting with Congress members, especially ones who are on the fence from moderate states or from purple states, and certainly going to try to persuade them for that piece of legislation. The president certainly has a lot of resources to influence Congress, one of which is the bully pulpit. When we talk about the bully pulpit, we're talking about the president's ability to persuade the general public. So if the general public is in favor of something, sometimes those Congress people might feel pressured. Now, the president is sometimes called the chief legislature, but remember, the president cannot introduce a bill to Congress. Only a member of Congress can do that. But in many ways, right, the president is going to craft an agenda of every term and say what the president wants to have seen done in Congress. So in many ways, Congress is having its agenda to some extent set by the president. Others do see the president as more of a facilitator who works at the margins of Congress. I think it's certainly a combination of both, but if you ever see this informal power of chief legislator, there's where you see it. And also, the president does have a role in the legislative process if in the event that the president is going to veto a bill or sign a bill into law. So certainly the president plays a significant role in that respect. Now, non-legislative duties of Congress include something called legislative oversight over the bureaucracy. They hold hearings, and sometimes if they think an agency is not doing its job well, they will defund that agency, or they will fund it if it is doing a very good job. But with legislative oversight, they're holding the bureaucracy accountable. A good example is with the Benghazi hearings when former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was accused of basically doing nothing with the Benghazi attacks. The committees are going to interview and hold open session hearings in front of the public, and they'll be asking Secretary of State Hillary Clinton questions about that. And I highly suggest that you YouTube that because that's a good example of legislative oversight. Other non-legislative duties: confirmation of presidential appointments, that's for the Senate, treaties also with the Senate, and impeachment with the House of federal judges and government officials, including the president, and then of course the Senate will hold that trial. All right, moving on. Let's look at Congress's role in the budget. And Congress, of course, sets the budget, right? All revenue bills are going to start in the House. We know that the House plays a major role in that respect, but to a larger degree with the Senate, they're also going to be crafting a budget. The president is going to establish a budget. They have something called the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, which establishes the budget, but is going to, of course, require both the Senate and the House's approval. And one thing that's going to happen is that they're going to have to reconcile the budget, where you're providing these changes to revenue and spending, and you only need a simple majority. And of course, each chamber has an appropriations committee in which they're going to be allocating money for a specific project that they might have or a certain agency. So when you appropriate money, that of course is the role of the committee in both the Senate and the House. So Congress and the budget. Sources of revenue: $3.4 trillion is expected in 2019, and this comes from a variety of different taxes. Income tax, of course, corporations pay taxes, social insurance taxes from Social Security and Medicare. So if you look at your paycheck, you'll see that money goes to those. There's also tariffs, which have been imposed, of course, on products being imported to the United States. And then you also have excise taxes, which are special taxes levied on specific commodities such as alcohol, tobacco, gasoline, etc. Now, of course, liberals are going to maintain that rich people should be taxed more, while conservatives believe that tax burden is too high, especially for corporations. And you saw that under President Trump during his first 2 years, where the tax bill is going to lower the corporate tax rate as well as income taxes across the board, but especially for the top 10%. And certainly that is a major difference between liberals and conservatives as to who should really be paying more taxes or less taxes. And certainly liberals are going to maintain that the rich people, especially corporations, should be taxed more. But again, conservatives thinking that that burden is too high. Now, when Congress does set the budget, there are actually things that they just can't reduce. There's something called mandatory spending, where they are required by law to fund certain projects. So a good example, Social Security, Medicare, right? It's mandatory spending. And this is a huge contributor to the deficit. Now, when we talk about the deficit, we're talking about the difference between spending and revenue. So the amount that you collect versus the amount that you spend is going to be the deficit. So for the 2019 budget, you spend $4.4 trillion and your revenue in taxes is only $3.4 trillion. Well, you have quite a significant deficit right there. Then you also have some money left over, and I use leftover quite loosely here, which is called discretionary spending, where the remaining money that is spent on other budgetary items. So if you're going to start some new program, that's fantastic. That's going to be used on discretionary spending. So I sort of equate it to, if you're a homeowner, right, sort of mandatory spending is you use some of your income for, your mortgage payment, your electric payment, your propane payment, your car payment, let's say, and then let's say the money that you have left over you spend on vacation. That money that you spend left over for vacation would be similar to discretionary spending. So it's going to go into other areas. But when you look at mandatory spending, Social Security eats up a large part of that. Medicare, Medicaid, certainly major issues in terms of how to control that spending, as it is a significant portion of the budget. And if you just look at the deficits in President's budget since 2012, you can see a significant divergence between what the budget is and versus what the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, expects those deficits to grow quite significantly. So we will leave it at that. But again, Congress has a lot of duties, from legislative duties to non-legislative duties, and they certainly have a major role in the process of basically all legislation, the budget, and there are many influences on top of that, from interest groups, the lobbyists, to even the president.